clock was set at 7 o'clock when Sarah Parker, a 32-year-old nurse, arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, an institution located in a small town in the United States. With a tired smile, she swapped her day's clothes for her blue uniform, feeling the familiar tension of the night shift approaching. For her, routine was a mix of challenges and rewards, a constant dance between care and urgency. Sarah has always had a generous heart and an unwavering willingness to help others. From an early age, her mother, also a nurse, inspired her with stories about the impact that one person can have on someone's life. Thus, she never hesitated to follow in her mother's footsteps, finding in nursing her true vocation. The long nights, the emergencies, and the patients who became friends were essential parts of his life. As she walked through the lit corridors of the hospital, Sarah did a quick check on her patients' medical records. Each had a story, some of them exciting, others tragic. She knew that every minute counted, especially in the ICU where the pressure was palpable and the challenges were constant. It was almost 7:30 p.m., and Sarah went to the ICU to start her rounds. The air was loaded with a familiar buzz, the beeping of the monitors, the whispering of doctors' conversations, and the characteristic smell of disinfectant. For her, this environment was a second home. But even with all the familiarity, there was something that kept her alert that night. A strange feeling she could not ignore. As she adjusted the equipment and checked the vital signs of patients, Sarah realized that her shift started like any other. But as soon as she arrived at bed 13, a restlessness took hold of her. The patient was there, wrapped in a network of wires and tubes, but there was no record of his entry into the system. He was so calm, so quiet, that it disturbed her even more. Sarah felt a chill in her spine and an irresistible urge to find out more about that mysterious man. Sarah stared at bed 13. The man lying there looked so calm that it was almost surreal. His eyes were closed, and the monitor next to him displayed a steady line without any sign of agitation. But for Sarah, what really bothered her was the complete absence of information about him. Usually, each patient had a detailed medical record that included their medical history, contact information, and the reasons for admission. But in this case, nothing. She made a mental note and decided to investigate. With the pen in hand, he began to review the patient's medical records, but soon realized that the man in bed 13 was nowhere. His heart began to speed. What could have happened so that he was there without records? An administrative error? An emergency case? The possibilities were endless, but the fact of not having answers left her distressed. "Hi, Sarah, all right?" called one of the nurses, Lucas, as he walked by her. "Hi, Lucas. Did you see who's in bed 13? She asked, trying to hide her restlessness. "Bed 13? I'm not sure, but I don't remember seeing anyone new." "Why? It's just, there's nothing in his chart. I don't know who he is or how he got here," she replied, her voice betraying a little anxiety. Lucas frowned but shook his head. "Strange. If there is no record, we can't do much. We will have to monitor it and wait for more information." Agreeing, Sarah returned to her job, but the feeling that something was wrong did not abandon her. As she walked through the ICU corridors, a persistent thought occurred to her. How can someone be here without anyone knowing who he is? She kept watching the man, but he remained motionless, as if he was stuck in a state of deep tranquility, or perhaps of an eternal dream. The night was advancing and Sarah made her rounds, always passing by bed 13. The man was there invariably with that distant and empty look. His coworkers began to notice his concern, but when he mentioned the patient, everyone seemed to ignore the seriousness of the situation. Dr. Margaret, her supervisor, heard his restlessness and looked at bed 13 with a semblance of disinterest. "He's stable, Sarah. That's what matters. Sometimes patients with no history show up. It's frustrating, but it happens," said Margaret, looking at the other monitors. Deep down, Sarah felt that it was not just a matter of stability. Something in the presence of that man seemed to weigh on her heart. Determination to find out who he was began to turn into obsession. That night, she knew she would need to find answers. Hours passed slowly as Sarah completed her rounds. The patient in bed 13 occupied her thoughts, becoming a disturbing presence that did not leave her alone. With each new moment she looked at him, she felt more determined to find the truth. After the shift, while the other nurses were saying goodbye and getting ready to go home, Sarah decided she needed to do something about it. Instead of going home and resting like everyone else, she went to the hospital administration. The hope of finding answers led her to a place where few would dare go during the early hours. Arriving at the administrative area, the lights were weak and the atmosphere carried a dense silence, broken only by the light hum of computers. Sarah approached the counter where an employee named Dave was working. He recognized her and smiled, but his gaze became suspicious when she asked to see the ICU patient records. "I don't know if that's allowed, Sarah. You know we need authorization to access those documents," said Dave, adjusting his glasses and looking at her with a skeptical expression. "I know, but it's an urgent situation. The patient in bed 13 has no record. We need to understand how he got there," she begged, her voice full of urgency. After a few seconds of hesitation, Dave sighed. "Okay, just for today. I'll let you take a look, but don't tell anyone, okay?" He stood up and took Sarah to an archive room. Upon entering, Sarah was impressed by the amount of folders stacked, each representing a patient who had already passed through the hospital. The smell of aged paper and disinfectant filled the air, and fluorescent lights buzzed gently. "We have records of years here. Feel free, but don't spend too much time." "I can't stay away for too long," said Dave as he left the room. Sarah sat down at a table and began to review the files, her fingers running by names and dates. Hours passed as she plunged into the paperwork. Familiar names surfaced, each story unique and painful, but nothing about the man in bed 13. The frustration grew with each passing second. Finally, exhausted and discouraged, Sarah began to accept the idea that perhaps the man had no past, but at the same time, uncertainty consumed it. With a resigned sigh, he decided to take another look before leaving. In the last folder, he found a name that made her stop: David Miller. She felt a chill in the spine while reading the chart. A car accident, serious, occurred years ago, and the description detailed the attempts to revive him that ended in tragedy. She saw the date and location of the accident, but what really shook her was the photo that came with the document. The man in bed 13 had a distant and sad look that echoed in the image before her. Was him. His heart popped. The man who watched in silence every night was, without a doubt, David Miller. With the chart in her hands, Sarah stood up and ran out of the file room, determined to confront the man in bed 13. What did he want? What had really happened that fateful night? Sarah took a deep breath as she walked through the ICU hallways, David Miller's chart in her hands trembling slightly. The revelation of her identity left her in a state of expectation and fear. What would she say? What could he reveal? Uncertainty accompanied her every step, but the need for answers drove her. Upon reaching bed 13, the environment seemed colder than before. The weak light of the monitor illuminated the face of the man, who remained with his eyes closed, alien to the world around him. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her emotions oscillating between compassion and terror. What if he really was a wandering spirit, as the retired nurse had suggested? She remembered Dona Celia and the stories of hauntings that she will hear throughout her career. "David," he began, his voice a little shaky. I found out who you are." To his surprise, the man opened his eyes slowly, revealing an empty look, but somehow full of pain and yearning. He did not answer, just observed her as if he was evaluating her. "I read your chart," she continued, almost not knowing how to articulate her thoughts. "You had an accident and you didn't survive. But you are here and I need to understand why." A deep silence settled between them, and Sarah felt her heart accelerate. The man began to move as if he was trying to speak. The monitor next to him sounded softly, marking each movement. Finally, his voice came out as a whisper, almost inaudible. "Help me." The request took her by surprise. "Help you? Oh, what do you need?" "I'm stuck," he said, his voice loaded with sadness. "Stuck between this world and the next. I can't, go away." Sarah's eyes widened. She didn't know what it meant. Arrested? But how is that possible? You died. You shouldn't be here. David closed his eyes again as if he was struggling with intense suffering. "There was something I left behind. Something that has not been solved. I can't remember." The anguish in his words reverberated through Sarah's heart. She knew that the situation was beyond medical comprehension. "So what can I do? How can I help you move on?" He stared at her, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw a spark of hope in her empty eyes. "Find the truth. Set me free." Not knowing exactly what to do, but feeling she was on the right track, Sarah decided that she would do whatever it took to help him. "I will find the truth, David. I promise." Determined, she walked away from bed 13, aware that the journey of discovery was just beginning. David's words echoed in her mind as she left the ICU, full of questions and the urgency to investigate what really happened on that fateful night of the accident. Determined to help David and unravel the mysteries surrounding his death, Sarah embarked on a frantic quest. In the following weeks, his routine at the hospital became a game of juggling. During the day, she did her rounds and tended to patients, but as soon as her shift was over, she immersed herself in her investigation. She began her search for the accident that led to David's bed 13. After some conversations with colleagues, he found that the accident had occurred on a rural road, known to be a black spot of collisions. Sarah approached the hospital administration and requested access to accident reports and any additional information that might be relevant. After much pressure, he got access to some information. The pages were stained and faded, but Sarah went through each document, absorbing details. The accident had been very serious. David was driving alone on a rainy night, and the report indicated that the car collided with an unruly truck. However, a part of the report called his attention. The eyewitness to the accident had not been identified. Intrigued, Sarah decided to visit the crash site. A winding road surrounded by tall trees awaited her. The place seemed quiet, but there was a tension in the air that made her uneasy. When he stopped on the side of the road, he looked around and tried to imagine what had happened that fateful night. While exploring the area, he saw a small bar by the side of the road. Maybe someone here has seen something, he thought, and decided to go in. The place had a nostalgic air, with walls decorated by old photos and an old wood smell. Sarah approached the counter, where an older man with a hat and a tired look was watching her. "Hi, I'm a nurse in the ICU of the nearby hospital. I'm investigating an accident that happened here a few years ago involving a man named David Miller," she began, a little hesitantly. The man frowned, his expression becoming pensive. "David? Yes, I remember him. He was a good boy. The accident was horrible. Were you here the night of the accident?" asked Sarah, hoping he could provide you with valuable information. "Yes, I was. The night was dark and rainy. I remember hearing the bang and running to the road. I couldn't help much. The truck was out of control and I couldn't see if there was anyone else in David's car," he explained, his voice heavy with grief. "But did anyone see what happened? Any witnesses who could know what really happened?" The old man shook his head. "No one I know. The truck driver ran away and David was left alone. There are rumors that he was haunted by something after the accident." The mention of haunting made Sarah's heart go wild. That was what Dona Celia had said. "What do you mean by haunted?" "It is said that sometimes it appears to those who have a connection with death. As a warning, or a cry for help." The revelation left her stunned. "Are you saying that David could be looking for help?" "If you're feeling that, maybe it's true," he replied, staring at her. After a longer conversation, Sarah thanked the man and left the bar, her thoughts bubbling. Now I had a new perspective on David's situation. The idea that he might be haunted by something, a cry for help she didn't yet fully understand, filled her with palpable fear. Returning to the hospital, a renewed determination took care of her. Not only did David need help, but something deeper and darker loomed over his death. Sarah decided that the next night of work, she would focus on understanding more about what might be connecting David to the world of the living and the dead. As the night advanced, she began her rounds. The environment was loaded with an unexplained tension, and every sound, every breath seemed amplified. When she reached bed 13, her heart popped as she saw David lying there with the empty gaze that haunted her. But this time she wasn't paralyzed by fear. She was determined to understand what he wanted. "David," she called, her voice soft but firm. "I know you're here. You need to tell me what happened. What do you want?" To his surprise, the monitors began to beep, and the apparatus around David came alive. Sarah felt a chill run through her spine but did not back down. In a moment of pure intensity, David turned his head slowly, his eyes staring at those of Sarah. A shadow seemed to dance on his face as if some part of him was struggling to manifest. "You can't help me," he replied in a low, distant voice, almost like a whisper. "I'm stuck between the worlds." Those words cut Sarah's heart. "But I want to help you. What happened on the night of the accident? What do you need me to do?" David closed his eyes, and the expression of pain became evident. There was something else on the road, something that should not be there. The truck wasn't just an accident. I saw something before it all happened." With this revelation, Sarah remembered what the man at the bar had mentioned. "What did you see, David? What was watching you?" He began to breathe heavily, and the atmosphere in the ICU became dense, as if something was approaching. Sarah felt the presence of something dark around them. "I don't know. Something called to me. Something that was hidden in the shadows. I couldn't escape." The tension grew and the heart apparatus began to accelerate. "David, I'm here. You're not alone. Tell me what to do to set you free," Sarah begged, her hands now holding David's in a gesture of empathy and connection. "Burn what's holding me," he said with effort, and his voice began to mix with a cacophony of whispers. "Just burn. What is in my past? Sarah felt a chill running through her spine. The connection she felt was intense but terrifying. What would be this past that he wanted her to burn? Hearing David's voice, an idea began to take shape in his mind. The story of the accident, the legends, the shadows. Everything was intertwined in a mystery that needed to be solved. Determination took hold of her. That night, as soon as her shift was over, Sarah decided she would look for more clues. Knew I couldn't keep David in jail any longer. He deserved rest. After shift, Sarah went to the hospital administration. With the help of a colleague, she got access to David's case file. The pages were yellow and worn, but the information was there. With a chill in his stomach, he read about the accident but found a mention of an ancient ritual performed by a group in search of power, something that could have attracted the dark force that David mentioned. With this new information, Sarah sought out the materials for the ritual. A part of the process involved burning an object that belonged to the deceased. Sarah's heart popped when she remembered something she had found on her first encounter with David. A small ring in the drawer of the nightstand. It was an object that could have belonged to him. That morning, he decided that at nightfall, he would return to the hospital and do what needed to be done. With the ring in hand, he followed the steps of the ritual. He lit a small fire in an isolated area of the hospital, surrounded by trees that seemed to watch what was about to happen. "Burn what holds you," she repeated to herself, holding the ring above the flame. With each instant, the atmosphere around her seemed to change. The wind howled, and for a moment she felt something watching her. With a determined movement, threw the ring into the flames. As the metal began to melt, a scream echoed in the air, and Sarah felt a wave of energy run through her body. The sky suddenly darkened, as if the world was adjusting to a new reality. The fire burned with a supernatural intensity, and suddenly a presence materialized before it. It was David, but not as before. His form now radiated light, as if he had finally found peace. "Thank you," he whispered, and then his figure began to dissipate, turning into a gentle breeze that enveloped Sarah. "Go in peace, David," she said, feeling tears running down her face. The weight that was in her heart dissipated, and a feeling of relief enveloped her. Upon returning to the hospital, he felt that the ICU was lighter. David was finally free. On the following nights, she noticed that bed 13 was empty, and a sense of tranquility accompanied her. David Miller's story was now only a memory, but Sarah knew that his spirit would continue to shine like a light in the darkness, grateful for the chance to help set him free. And so, the nurse who always cared for the living now also became a guardian of lost souls. My name is Marcos and I am a nurse. After many years working in a busy hospital in Sao Paulo, I made the decision to seek new opportunities in another city in the United States. The idea of starting over in a different environment filled me with expectation. It was a chance to explore new horizons in my career, as well as allowing me to meet a new community. Upon arriving in the city, I was greeted by a warm atmosphere and an atmosphere that promised new experiences. The hospital where I got a job was modern and well-equipped, and I soon realized that the team was made up of dedicated professionals. Despite the initial excitement, a feeling of restlessness began to accompany me from my first day. As I adapted to the new environment, I felt that something was not entirely right. It was a mixture of excitement and nervousness, as if I was about to enter into unknown territory. However, my focus has always been on patient care, and I knew that I needed to put these insecurities aside. After all, my priority was to ensure that everyone received the best possible treatment. The first days were intense, full of emergencies and challenges. During the long hours of duty, my mind took turns between the anxiety to adjust myself and the determination to make a difference in the lives of my patients. However, it was during one of those busy nights that a particular case caught my attention. A young man named Daniel arrived in the emergency room after a serious car accident. He was in critical condition, and the medical team fought tirelessly to stabilize him. When we finally transferred him to the ICU, the tension in the air was palpable. What I didn't know was that Daniel's journey and the connection I would establish with his family would change my life forever. While Daniel was accommodated in his bed in the ICU, I caught myself watching the boy, still so young and full of life, now trapped in a state of coma. My mind was running with questions. How could someone so young face such a devastating situation? And although I tried to concentrate on my work, the feeling that there was something else in this case, an untold story, began to haunt me. In the ICU, The environment was marked by monitors that emitted regular beeps and the murmur of conversations between doctors and nurses. However, there was a constant presence that began to stand out. Cloves, the uncle of Daniel. A middle-aged man with a worried look, he became a fixture in the hospital, visiting his nephew every night. Cloves always arrived at the same time, bringing with it an air of concern that would not go unnoticed. His conversations with me were direct, but laden with a desperate hope. He spoke about Daniel's dreams and ambitions, as if trying to keep the connection between them alive even in the darkness of the coma. It was evident that the bond between uncle and nephew was deep, and his presence often reminded me of the fragility of life. As the nights turned into weeks, I noticed something peculiar in Cloves' visits. Although he was always polite and kind, there was a restlessness in his gaze that seemed to grow every day. He often asked if Daniel showed any signs of improvement and if I could ensure that he would receive the best possible care. There was an urgency in his words that made me uncomfortable. What exactly worried him? One night, while I was making a tour of the ICU, Cloves approached me with a grave expression. "Mark," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you must promise that you will take good care of Daniel. He is the only family I have left." There was a weight in his words, something I could not fully identify. "Sure, Cloves," I replied, trying to convey the confidence he needed to hear. "We're doing everything we can." After this conversation, as Cloves walked away, I could not help feeling that there was something else behind his concerns. A feeling began to form in my mind, an unsettling whisper that made me question their relationship. What could be so alarming to Cloves, and why did he seem so desperate? The restlessness grew within me, and I knew that I needed to find out more about Daniel's life and his uncle's, even if it meant unearthing secrets that could be dark and disturbing. In the days that followed, Daniel remained in a coma, but his condition began to change slowly. The monitors, which previously showed only straight lines, began to register small variations. A movement in the fingers here, a change in heart rate there. And whenever that happened, I looked at Cloves, who seemed even more anxious and attentive to every sign of recovery. What did he know that I didn't already know? After weeks in a coma, one night while I was checking Daniel's vital signs, something extraordinary happened. The monitors began beeping irregular, calling my attention. I ran to the bed and found Daniel moving, as if he was struggling to get out of a deep sleep. He began to move his fingers and his eyes flashed under his closed eyelids. Quickly, I called the medical team, and soon a small crowd of professionals gathered around the bed. A mood of anticipation and nervousness was in the air. When Daniel finally opened his eyes, it was as if a wave of relief swept through the room. His recovery was a miracle we all expected, but at the same time there was a strange feeling in the air. While he adjusted to reality, a detail caught my attention: the absence of Cloves. Throughout the period that Daniel was in a coma, Cloves had religiously visited his nephew every night. However, since Daniel had awakened, Cloves has not appeared. His absence was palpable, as if a familiar presence had been abruptly cut off. It made me restless and made me question what had really happened to him. Over the next few days, the medical team closely monitored Daniel's recovery. He was confused but gradually began to remember simple things: his childhood, his friends, and of course his uncle Cloves. During a conversation with Daniel, I took the opportunity to ask about his uncle. "Do you remember Cloves?" I asked cautiously. Daniel's eyes lit up with a melancholy expression. "Yes, Cloves was my favorite uncle. He was always there for me," he replied, his voice soft but loaded with sadness. "He used to tell me stories and teach me about life. But wait, where is he now?" The question made my heart race. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. He was here every night while you were in a coma. But since you woke up, he didn't show up." Daniel frowned, an expression of confusion mixed with concern appearing on his face. "That cannot be true, Mark. Cloves, he died years ago in a car accident." The revelation left me speechless. Was it possible that the man who came every night to the hospital, showing such concern and care, was a ghost from his past? The idea seemed absurd, but there was also no way to ignore the strange feeling that had accompanied me since the beginning of the journey. The restlessness in my chest grew with each moment, and I knew that I needed to understand better what was happening. Daniel began to adapt to the new reality, but the absent presence of Cloves hovered over us like a shadow. What had happened to the uncle he loved so much? And more importantly, what did it mean for Daniel's emotional recovery? Determined to unravel this mystery, I knew I had to investigate further into Cloves' life and the true nature of the night hospital visits. With each answer I found, more questions would arise, and I was ready to dive into this puzzle. After Daniel's shocking revelation about the death of Cloves, My mind was a storm of questions. How could a man who died years ago have been present in every night that Daniel was in a coma? I needed to understand the connection between the two, and the first thing I decided to do was talk to Daniel again, seeking more information about his uncle. One afternoon, as the sun was setting and the hospital was filled with long shadows, I went to Daniel's bed. He was sitting watching out the window. The soft light lit his face, but the expression in his eyes was of worry and confusion. "Daniel," I started, "can you tell me more about Cloves? How he was and what happened in the accident?" Daniel turned to me, his melancholy look. "Cloves was always my support. He taught me to fish, ride a bike, and face life with courage. He was always around, and his death was a hard blow to me." He took a deep breath, as if trying to calm his emotions. "The accident happened during a storm. He was coming home and lost control of the car. I never could handle it well." I listened intently, trying to understand the depth of pain he carried. "Do you think he could have come back to help you in some way?" I asked, trying to connect the dots. Daniel shook his head slowly. "Don't know, Mark. The pain of loss can be so intense that sometimes I feel like he's still here, protecting me." As we talked, a strange feeling began to grow inside me. If Cloves had really returned, it could be a manifestation of the love and protection he always offered to Daniel. But the idea of a spirit wandering around the hospital to comfort a loved one was both comforting and disturbing. In the following days, I began to pay more attention to the nights when the hospital was quieter. I went to each turn, watching the empty corridors, the whispers of the wind in the windows, and the soft lighting that seemed to dance on the walls. One of those nights, when everything was calm, I had the impression of hearing murmurs coming from the nurses' rest area. My heart popped, and I decided to investigate. I approached, and as I passed through the corridor, I saw a shadow moving quickly, as if someone was hiding. I followed the shadow, but when I got closer, there was no one. The silence was almost deafening, and the only thing I could hear was my own heart beating hard in my chest. Feeling a chill in my spine, I returned to the ICU where Daniel was still. As I entered, I noticed that he seemed restless, as if something was troubling him. "Daniel," I said, "are you all right?" He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Mark, did you ever feel that someone was watching you? As if a presence was there but you couldn't see?" The question made me freeze. "Yes, I feel it since you woke up," I confessed. "It may be the spirit of Cloves wanting to communicate in some way." Daniel was silent, thoughtful. He then looked at me, his expression was a mixture of hope and fear. "If Cloves is here, maybe he has something to tell us." The idea of seeking communication with the presence of Cloves seemed both a solution and a risk. We could discover something that would change everything, but we could also open a door to the unknown that could lead us to places we didn't want to go. Determined to better understand this connection, we decided that the next night we would go on a little vigil, hoping something would come out. As we prepared for the vigil, a new wave of anxiety and expectation took hold of me. What would we find? The answers were closer than we thought, but they could also bring out buried secrets. The tension in the air was palpable, and I knew that the truth about Cloves and his visitors awaited us in the shadows of the hospital. That night, I prepared for the vigil with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The ICU was quiet, and the dim light of the lamps cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. Daniel was calmer now, determined to understand what was happening. He brought some of his personal things, an object that symbolized his connection with Cloves, a small fishing bait that his uncle had given him as a child. We believed that perhaps this would attract the presence of Cloves. We sat in a corner of the ICU room, surrounded by machines that monitored Daniel's vital signs. While we waited, we started talking about the memories of Daniel with Cloves, each memory an echo of laughter and love. The atmosphere was full of emotions, and the darkness seemed to absorb our words. As the night deepened, a strange tension began to take hold of the environment. I looked at the monitor next to Daniel, and the numbers were stable, but something seemed out of place. A cold stream of air passed through the room, making the ICU door swing gently. I turned to look and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. "Did you feel that?" I asked Daniel, my voice almost a whisper. He nodded, his nervous expression. It was then that we began to hear a distant murmur, as if someone were calling the name of Daniel. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but Daniel heard too. His eyes widened and he turned to me. "Mark, did you hear that? It's Cloves." The murmur intensified and the atmosphere became oppressive. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and a shadow began to form around the corner, taking the shape of a man. My heart pounded. It was as if the very essence of Cloves were manifesting before us. "Cloves?" Daniel called, his voice trembling. The shadow hesitated and then began to approach us. The air was filled with an electric voltage, and the sound of the machines began to whistle, the monitors flashing in response to the presence. "Daniel?" The voice that echoed in the room was weak, but charged with emotion. It was unmistakably Chloe's voice. "Daniel, I am here." Chloe's vision began to form more clearly, but it was not as before. He seemed ethereal, as if made of light and shadow. "You must listen, Daniel. There is something you need to know." Daniel's expression was a mixture of shock and relief. Finally, he was face to face with his uncle. "Chloe, you're here. What happened?" Daniel asked, his voice full of urgency. "I came to protect you, but it's not just that. You need to understand that what happened to me was not an ordinary accident. There are forces at play, things you still don't understand," Chloe said, his voice echoing like an echo in the space around us. I was paralyzed, watching everything in silence. The reality we knew was unfolding before us, revealing a mystery much greater than we could imagine. Chloe continued, "Daniel, the nights I was here were to protect you. What happened to me was part of something bigger, something that's still happening." The tension in the room intensified as Chloe's figure began to fade slowly. "But you must be alert. There are dangers you cannot see. I will be with you, but you must seek the truth." And with these words, the presence began to dissipate, and the monitors of the hospital returned to normal. The room was quiet again, but the feeling that something significant had happened remained in the air. "Chloe, come back," Daniel shouted, but the shadow had already disappeared. I looked at him, and his expression was a mixture of hope and confusion. What did he mean by that? What's going on? We knew that the connection with Chloe had opened a door to a much deeper mystery, and now we had to find out what was this danger that threatened Daniel. The urgency of the situation became more and more real, and the journey for truth had only just begun. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions and uncertainties. Daniel and I became obsessed with Chloe's message, determined to find out the truth behind his death and what it really meant, the warning about the dangers that were coming. We went through documents, sought information about Chloe's past, and even talked with friends and family acquaintances, but each clue seemed to lead us to a dead end. One night while we were in the hospital, Daniel decided he needed to see the place where Chloe had worked before his death. "Perhaps there is something there that I have not noticed," he suggested, with a renewed determination in his eyes. I agreed to accompany him, and together we left for the old warehouse where Chloe had worked as manager. The darkness of night enveloped the warehouse, and the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. As we entered, the dim light of our lanterns illuminated the dusty shelves and abandoned objects. The smell of mold and metal was intense, as if the space was holding secrets long forgotten. We walked through the place, and as we went deeper, a strange sensation enveloped us. Daniel stopped suddenly, looking at a wall covered by a wood siding. "Here. I feel there is something here," he said, his voice full of expectation. We began to investigate, and as we removed some planks, we revealed a small door that was locked. Daniel's heart exploded. I knew there was something hidden here. He took a metal bar we found around us and forced the door open. As we entered, a dark room was revealed, full of documents, boxes, and old photos. Daniel started to examine the papers and soon found a series of documents related to a fraud scheme involving the company where Chloe worked. "He was investigating something much bigger," Daniel muttered, eyes wide with shock. As we looked at the documents, a familiar voice cut through. "You shouldn't be here." It was a woman with a threatening look. "What are you looking for?" Daniel and I turned around, and I recognized the figure as being Chloe's former assistant. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" I asked, the fear growing inside me. "I knew you would come." Chloe was about to expose something that could ruin us all. "He cannot stay here," she said, stepping forward with determined expression. "Now, leave before it is too late." Daniel was hesitant, but I realized that this was the answer we needed. "You know what happened to him, don't you?" I asked, challenging her. "You were with him when it all happened." Sarah hesitated, and for a moment his mask of determination faltered. "Yes, but he did not hear the warnings. What Chloe found out was very dangerous, and he thought he could handle it. He underestimated the risks, and it cost him his life. The truth we were so searching for was before us, but the fear of revelation was palpable." I had a cold. "You have to help us, Sarah. We need to know how this is connected with Daniel," I begged, hoping she could understand the gravity of the situation. She looked at us, and finally the fear in her eyes turned to compassion. "If you want the truth, then you must be prepared for what comes next. Chloe was about to discover something that may still be in the works. You must leave this city as soon as possible, or you too may become the next victims." Her words echoed in our minds. Daniel and I exchanged a look, and the reality of what we were facing settled. The connection with Cloves had revealed a world of dangers we did not imagine. With the documents in hand and the truth in our possession, we knew that our journey was far from over. With the weight of revelation in our hearts, we decided to leave the warehouse and move on, determined to unravel the web of corruption that involved the death of Cloves. Whatever Cloves had found not only affected us, but was now a matter of survival. And as we moved away, a cold breeze passed us, as if the presence of Cloves was guiding us towards the unknown. The night shift was always the quietest, but also the loneliest. The cold, white lights of the hospital cast shadows stretched across the hallways, and the muffled sound of the heart monitors seemed to echo throughout. The heavy silence of the palliative care ward brought with it a feeling of emptiness that only those who spent the night there could understand. For me, a nurse for more than a decade, that was almost routine. Almost. I used to say to the new employees that the constant silence ended up becoming a companion, almost comforting. But that night, something was different. It was not the physical fatigue, something common in long and poorly slept nights, but a restlessness that I could not identify. From the moment I entered the hospital, I felt a weight in the air, as if something invisible was watching me. The patients, all of them in terminal states, remained in their beds, each quietly fighting their personal battles. The air smelled of antiseptic and disinfectant, but also carried the inevitable smell of death. I knew some lives would end before dawn. For some, that would be their last night. While I was doing my first round, checking the monitors and adjusting serum, the clock marked 2 o'clock in the morning. It was the time when most people sleep soundly, but for me it was the point where fatigue began to weigh. Looked at the monitors blinking, each beep marking the time remaining for the patients. I couldn't help feeling a little helpless. It was then that the light of the corridor blinked. A single quick blink, as if it had failed for a second. I looked towards the switch but saw nothing wrong. I continued my way thinking it was an electrical fault, nothing more. But deep down, something told me that it was not just this. I continued, trying to focus on the patients and not on the growing sense of restlessness. Later, when I returned to the corridor, the lights blinked again, this time more intense. I looked around, trying to find an explanation, but the corridor was empty. I approached one of the windows and the light stopped failing. A shiver ran through my spine. Maybe it was just the stress of the night shift, I thought, but I couldn't help feeling that there was something more there, something I couldn't see. The clock now set almost 3 a.m. and I had already done my second round. Everything seemed calm except for that persistent feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the air were heavier, loaded with a presence that I could not identify. But as always, I pushed these thoughts to the bottom of my mind. Fatigue, I repeated to myself. Just fatigue. While checking the devices of one of the patients, Mrs. Parker, something strange happened. She was in a terminal state, without consciousness for days. Their vital functions were maintained only by appliances, and there was no sign of brain activity. Still, the monitor started recording sudden spikes. I looked at the screen, confused. The brain waves, which should be almost flat, rose sharply. For a moment, it seemed that she was reacting to something, but how could that be possible? Approached her, adjusting the serum and checking vital signs. No visible change. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing slow and irregular, almost as if she was about to give up. But the monitors did not lie. There was something going on, something that made me feel a shiver coming up the spine. I tried not to think about it too much, recording the change in the chart, but my heart was racing. I left Mrs. Brown's room, Parker, and walked to the nursing station, still thinking about the peaks of brain activity. Maybe some error on the monitor, I thought. Or maybe not. Later, the silence was broken again. This time it wasn't the lights flashing but a distant sound. I stood still for a moment, trying to identify where it came from. It was a muffled, almost imperceptible murmur, as if it came from a closed room. Followed the sound down the hall to another patient's room door, Mr. Wilkins. I entered the room. His heart monitor indicated that life was already fading, but something caught my attention immediately. The door was half open, even though I was sure that I had left it closed during the last round. Approaching, I realized that the murmur had stopped, but the feeling of being observed returned even stronger. I looked around, but there was no one there but Mr. Wilkins, completely immobile. The bedroom window was slightly open, letting a cold stream of air invade the room. I quickly closed it, and while doing so, I felt a bit of discomfort. It was not just the cold. The murmur seemed to come from the corridor, but no one was there. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was really alone in that ward. When I left the room, the lights in the hallway blinked again. And this time, I knew it wasn't a simple electrical failure. The hospital environment seemed to have changed completely. The constant sound of the heart monitors, which before brought me a kind of familiar comfort, now seemed distant, muffled by something I could not define. I felt the weight of night intensify, a silent darkness, as if something invisible was approaching. During my third round, I went back to Mrs. Parker's room. I expected to find everything as the last time. Absolute silence, stable monitor, signs that her life was slowly disappearing. However, when I entered the room, I felt an immediate shiver. The air seemed more dense, almost oppressive. The light from the headboard blinked for a second, but this time I could not ignore. Approached the bed, adjusting Mrs. Parker's blanket. She was still, her eyes still closed, and her body almost without reaction. The monitor indicated that she did not have much time. But then, as I was preparing to leave the room, I heard something that made my blood cold. "Elizabeth." The voice was weak, a whisper almost imperceptible. I stopped at the same instant, my heart pounding. I looked at the patient, incredulous. Her lips moved slightly, forming the word again, "Elizabeth?" "My name." She had said my name. My whole body was paralyzed as if I had frozen in place. How did she know my name? Mrs. Parker was in a coma for days with no response to the world around him. And even before that, we had never talked. She was completely unconscious when I took the shift. So how was it possible? Before I could react, the voice came again, but this time she said more. "I know what you did." My breath failed. Those words went through my mind like a knife. How could she know? Panic took hold of me as I tried to process what I had just heard. I approached the bed further, hesitant, watching Mrs. Parker's serene face, her eyes still closed as if in a deep sleep. She did not move, but her words still echoed in my head. I tried to rationalize. It was tiredness, that's all it could be. There was no way she would know anything about me, my life outside the hospital. And even if I knew, how could she speak being in that state? I took a step back, my body trembling. Mrs. Parker's heart monitor again whistled, this time slowly and irregularly. It was the sound of life fading away. She was in the last moments. A part of me wanted to call someone, anyone, to share what I was living. But at the same time, I knew that no one would believe me. I looked at her one last time, her lips now motionless, and I stepped away, rushing out of the room. The corridor seemed colder than before, and the light still flickered as if to confirm that something supernatural was indeed happening. I went back to the nursing station, trying to regain control of my breathing. But as I sat down, all I could hear in my mind was Mrs. Parker's faint voice repeating my name, and the phrase that would not come out of my head. "I know what you did." After what happened in Mrs. Parker's room, I knew that night would not be like the others. The hospital, which before seemed only a quiet and cold place of work, was now loaded with a presence that I could not understand. Something was there, something I could not see, but I could feel it with every step, with every sound that echoed in the empty corridors. The nursing station seemed like a temporary refuge, a place where I tried to convince myself that it was safe. But what I had just experienced was not out of my head. "I know what you have done." Those words not only haunted me, but also evoked memories that I struggled to forget. Something in my past, something that I had buried deep, now seemed to be coming back to the surface. Still sitting at the station, I felt someone beside me. I quickly turned around, hoping to see one of my colleagues or perhaps a doctor. But the corridor was empty. Silence was deafening. I stood there for a moment, waiting to hear footsteps, a voice, any sign of life. But there was nothing. I decided to do one more round, even if fear began to dominate my rationality. I needed to keep busy. I needed to keep working to ward off that feeling of growing panic. I walked through the corridors with fast steps, but every room that passed, the silence seemed deeper, almost overwhelming. When I got to Mr. Wilkins' room, I felt the air get colder. His monitor indicated that death was approaching, his breathing was irregular, and I knew there was little time left. When checking vital signs, something unexpected happened. The lights blinked again, but this time, unlike the other times, they went out completely. I stood in the dark, my heart pounding. This can't be happening. I whispered to myself, trying to calm myself down. I reached out in the dark, groping the wall for the switch, but before I could find it, I heard a voice. "Elizabeth." The Queen. It was the same voice. Faint, almost like an echo, but clear enough to blow me out of breath. The sound came from the corridor. I swiveled towards the door, trying to focus my vision on the darkness. The corridor seemed even longer and deeper than before, as if it had no end. I knew I should leave the room, run to the station, and call for help. But my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, as if some invisible force held me in place. The cold seemed to penetrate my skin, and I wondered why the hospital heating system was not working, until I realized that the cold came from inside me. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the end of the corridor. I could not see clearly, but it seemed to be the figure of a person, tall and immobile. My eyes tried to adjust to the dark, but the more I looked, the more the figure distorted, as if it was wrapped in a thick fog. And then she began to approach. The sound of slow and heavy steps echoed through the hall. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would explode. I tried to scream, but my voice didn't come out. The figure kept moving forward, and with each step, the temperature dropped even more. Finally, the lights flickered again and for a brief moment illuminated the corridor. But the figure had disappeared. The corridor was empty, as if nothing had happened. However, I knew what I had seen. Something was coming, something that seemed determined to find me. I ran back to the nursing station, not looking back, the dread clinging to me like a shadow. When I arrived, I saw the clock marking 3:30 a.m. It was only a few hours before the end of my shift, but somehow I knew that night would be much longer than any other. I needed answers. And for the first time in my life, I feared that what was happening had no rational explanation. Something was chasing me and I didn't know why. The hours that followed were the longest and most distressing of my life. I felt that with every step taken, with every second that passed, something approached. Something I could not see but knew to be there in the shadows, watching me. The nursing station, once a place of refuge, now seemed suffocating, as if the hospital was closing around me. It was still a little over an hour before the end of my shift, but I could no longer ignore what was happening. Something was profoundly wrong that night. I decided I couldn't go on alone. I took the phone from the station to call Dr. Marta, the person in charge of the shift, but when I tried to dial the number, all I heard was the sound of static. Hung up and tried again. The same strange noise. A feeling of despair began to squeeze my chest. I looked around, the hospital in absolute silence. Only the distant sound of the cardiac monitors in the intensive care rooms. A part of me wanted to run out, get out of that place as fast as possible. But I knew I needed to understand what was going on. Take a deep breath and walk to Mrs. Parker's room. There was something about her, something in that room that I felt was at the center of it all. As I opened the door, I felt the air become even denser. She was still there, motionless, her vital signs slowly fading. The monitor showed a nearly straight line, indicating that the end was near. I approached her bed cautiously. There was absolute silence in the room, the only sound was that of machines. But suddenly I felt something different. A shiver came up through my spine and I knew, before even seeing it, that I was no longer alone. "Elizabeth." The voice came again, but this time it was clear, loud, as if Mrs. Parker was fully conscious. I looked at her, and to my astonishment, her eyes were open. She looked at me with an empty look, but there was something else. Her lips moved slowly, forming words that made no sense. "I know what you did." My hands began to tremble. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. She took a deep breath, as if struggling to say something more. "You can't run away from the past." My heart sped. I knew what she was talking about, even if I tried to deny it. Many years ago, before I worked in that hospital, a mistake I made still haunted me. I had done my best to bury that memory, to move on with my life, but now it seemed the past was reaching me in a way I never imagined. Mrs. Parker writhed in bed, her breathing becoming irregular, and before I could do anything the monitor started whistling. She was going into cardiac arrest. I ran to the door, calling for help, but to my horror, the lights in the corridor began to go out one by one, like a wave of darkness approaching. The walls seemed to close, and suddenly I heard again the sound of footsteps. The figure I had seen before. Now I knew it was not my imagination. I could feel her, closer and closer. With Mrs. Parker's monitor ringing incessantly, I went back to her, trying to start the resuscitation procedures. But something paralyzed me. When I touched his cold hand, I saw that his eyes, so empty before, were now fixed on mine. There was a strange calm in her expression, as if she already knew that the end was there. And then, in a weak, panting voice, she said one last thing that froze my blood. "He's here, for you." The monitor stopped, and the loud and continuous sound of his death echoed through the room. The lights flickered one last time, and at that moment I knew the darkness was not just outside. It was inside the hospital. Inside of me. Mrs. Parker's death was a devastating blow, but the terror was far from over. As soon as his monitor stopped beeping, the darkness in the hallway seemed to intensify, and the cold spread to every corner of the room. What had happened? Why were things like this? I was taken by a wave of panic, unable to process the loss. I needed to get out of there. I stood up quickly, but before I could take a step, the door closed with a bang. I tried to open it, but it was locked. A sharp cold ran through my body, and the feeling that I was being watched became overwhelming. The lights began to flash again, and the figure appeared before me, immersed in darkness. It was a formless presence, but I could feel its weight as if it were full of anger and pain. I looked around, looking for a way out, but there was no escape. "Elizabeth." The voice echoed through the room, clearer than ever. It was a mix of many voices, as if every lost soul in that hospital were speaking at the same time. "You can't run away from what you did. I don't know what you're talking about," I cried, my voice echoing on the walls. But deep down I knew the guilt of my past could not be ignored. The figure advanced, and I backed back to the wall, terrified. And then it all made sense. I remembered a night years ago, an accident that I had tried to forget. I was not just a nurse. I was responsible for the life of a patient who had died in my hand. I could have done more, but I didn't. And that pain, that guilt, now came back to confront me. "You are the reason we're here," the figure whispered, the darkness enveloping her, shaping itself into shapes that reminded me of patient faces I'd lost. I was surrounded by all the lives I couldn't save. Desperate, I closed my eyes and tried to get away from the weight of his words. But the pain of guilt became unbearable. What did I need to do? I just wanted to forget. But there was no way. The darkness grew, and in a last act of despair I cried out, "I'm sorry. Forgive me. Leave me alone." At that moment, a deep silence took hold of the room. The figure stopped, and I could feel a wave of sadness and understanding. The light started to blink less frantically, and the pressure in the environment decreased. "Forgiveness is not forgetfulness, Elizabeth. It's accepting pain and learning to live with it," the voice whispered, now softer. As soon as these words echoed, the shadows began to dissipate, and the forms that once haunted the room were gone, leaving only solitude. Mrs. Parker's monitor started beeping again, but it was not a sign of death. It was as if she was transitioning to something beyond, and now I knew it was time for me to do the same. With one last look at Mrs. Parker's body, which now looked at peace, I finally got up. The door opened slowly, revealing the lit corridor. The feeling of being free from the weight of guilt was liberating. I left the room, and for the first time in many hours I took a deep breath. The hospital lights shone brightly, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe I could face the future, even if it meant living with pain. That night, the darkness had confronted me, but I had found a way of acceptance. As a nurse, I knew that life and death were inevitable parts of a cycle. And now I was ready to move on, carrying with me the lessons of the past. As I left the hospital, the first light of morning began to rise on the horizon, bringing hope and a new beginning. Finally, the darkness was no longer my enemy, but a part of the path I had chosen to follow.